Hi, it's Halloween. We've got a real live witch on the line, Pamela Grossman. Pam Grossman, she's a writer, curator, teacher of magical practice and history, host of the Witch Wave podcast, and author of a new book, Waking the Witch, Reflections on Women, Magic, and Power. And Pam, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. You know, as tempted as I am to deal with this, like, you know, oh, hey, let's have fun, it's Halloween, and all that kind of hokey stuff. This is actually a serious topic that has some substantial depth. I've only had an opportunity to spend a little bit of time with your book, but a dear friend of mine, Rianne Eisler, has written a number of books, The Chalice and the Blade, and a number of others about the history of women and women's rights throughout history. I mean, in a large and a multi-millennial context, you know, multiple thousands of years. Len Schlein wrote a brilliant book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess. What I learned from those two people, who I both knew, and Lena has passed on, but in fact, Rianne and I were just talking about a month ago in email, is that prior to the 1500s, basically, to the 16th century, women played a major role in society in power functions. They were physicians, they were healers. That Mary worship was the principal practice in Christianity. Virtually all the churches in Europe were dedicated to Mary up until the early 1500s. And then something happened, and nobody's quite sure exactly what it is. Len Schlein's theory was that basically literacy got legalized, and that changed the way our brains work. But who knows? But something happened, and the men rose up and basically took over, and all those women who were celebrated as great healers and midwives and herbalists became portrayed as witches. And there was a publication of this nasty, nasty book, The Malleus Maleficarum, or whatever it is. I'm sure you know. And, you know, in the late 1400s, early 1500s, that just like brought all this stuff forward. And Len Schlein pointed out, within 2 generations, women went from being venerated to being actively burned at the stake as witches all across Europe. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. First of all, I'm a big fan of both of those writers, and it's amazing that you got a chance to get to speak with them directly. I'm only familiar with their books. But essentially, what you're talking about is the witch hunts that happened in Europe and then a little bit later in the New England colonies. And you're absolutely right. A lot of that was sparked by the advent of the printing press. And the Malleus Maleficarum, which is the book that you're referring to, which in English is translated roughly to The Witch's Hammer, was a book that came out at the end of the 15th century. It was written by a man named Heinrich Kramer, who was a friar, and he essentially was trying to link together the idea not only that witchcraft was real, because a lot of people believed that witchcraft was real, but that it was specifically women who were most susceptible to the devil's temptations to draw them into witchcraft, because he believed that women were lusty, he believed they were stupid, and ambitious, interestingly, and gossipy. And because, you know, certainly anybody could have been a witch back then, or was considered to have been a witch, he was really the first person to popularize the notion that it would usually be women because they had that weaker, as he believed, kind of temperament. And then ever since, we have considered witches to be linked with women for better and for worse.
Right, and this has led to, 6 centuries of persecution of women and justified patriarchy, justified the exploitation of women, justified men holding power in virtually every dimension in ways that are, I mean, if you look at it in the arc of, the last 500-600 years, literally just starting to break down in my lifetime. I mean, in the last 40, 50 years, we're seeing women elected to Congress, women elected to the Senate, more on one party than the other, certainly, but possibly a woman becoming president of the United States. In fact, the last woman who ran got 3 million more votes than the guy who's in there right now.
That is a fact.
Yeah, so it seems to me that things are getting better, generally for women. How are things getting better for women who practice non-traditional traditional religions, or who, as you know, you call yourself a witch, who would embrace those kinds of titles.
Absolutely. And you're right. Slowly but surely it is getting better, though not fast enough, in my opinion.
Amen.
But what's really interesting is not only that people are identifying as witches in a more positive way now, and I'll certainly talk about that, but actually with every wave of feminism since the 19th century, we've seen the figure of the witch be reframed and reclaimed as a positive feminist icon. So what we're experiencing now in this fourth wave of feminism is an extension of those other waves. And essentially what's happening is multifold. First of all, there are a lot more people like myself, people of all genders, we should say, who are identifying as witches for literal spiritual reasons. They, like me, are practicing some form of modern witchcraft. I personally call myself a pagan, though I'm also still Jewish. You could call me a Jew witch, if you will. But essentially, you know, there is this growing movement of modern witchcraft practitioners, and that is becoming far less stigmatized with time. But the other thing that's happening is that the witch has become this archetype that a lot of feminists and progressive, rebellious people are tapping into for political reasons. Much in the same way the phrase nasty woman was originally this negative epithet that then people reclaimed for themselves in this more positive kind of like tongue-in-cheek, rebellious way. So, too, we're seeing that with the word witch and the identity of witch for political reasons. So it's fascinating that this is happening at the same time. In my case, I use the word witch to describe myself for both of those reasons, the spiritual and the political.
And you're relatively young. I had a conversation with Rhiannon at her home. David Lloyd, by the way, her husband, has written some brilliant stuff on Darwin. I was a member of his Darwin project, saying that Darwin was not talking about survival of the fittest, which is kind of a tangent, but it's really, if you like Rhiannon's writings, you should check out David Lloyd's stuff. But we were talking about elder women, older women, that in traditional societies, even today, in many traditional societies, Aboriginal, Indigenous societies, and in European society prior to the 1500s, older women were viewed as wise. They were the wise elders. Yeah. They were the ones who provided protection. They were often the ones who made the decisions for the community. They had enormous political power. And then post 1500, as their, you know, as the patriarchy emerged, you know, with a vengeance, they were defined as the crone, and that was part of this whole witch archetype. I mean, you see little kids dressed up as witches. They're not just dressed up as people wearing black hats and a cape or something like that. They're typically wearing a mask that makes them look like they're in their 80s, right? Their nose is extended out. They've got old warts on them and stuff like that. They're old. That idea of, can you speak to that idea of, and reclaiming the idea of the older woman as the wise woman? I'm seeing this right now. You know, Jane Fonda, 75 years old, just got arrested, you know, protesting some of Trump's craziness. A number of women have been on this program. In fact, she's been on this program, kind of reclaiming both their femininity and their age. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. So getting back to the time of the witch hunts, though people of all ages and all genders were accused of being witches, it was most often women over 40 who had the most accusations leveled against them. Often they also might not have had children or not enough children. Sometimes they had land and they were widows and people wanted their land. But that marker of them being generally over 40 is a pretty consistent through line. And the reason for that is, as today still, we often consider women who are past reproductive age or past the age of, you know, sexual desirability as no longer appealing, no longer valuable. Whereas, you know, certainly the goddess movement and the feminist movement in general, especially here in America and in the UK, where a lot of it was first sparking, has tried to reclaim the fact that as women get older, even if they're not reproducing anymore, or people aren't necessarily desiring them in the same way anymore, that they still have immense experience and wisdom, and how valuable that is. So there was a writer named Robert Graves, who you might be familiar with. Mm-hmm. He wrote a book called The White Goddess. And he was really one of the first historians to talk about this framing of goddesses as a triple goddess. And that framing of the triple goddess is said to have three aspects: the maiden, the mother, and the crone. And this triple goddess was, it's something that you can trace in a lot of different mythologies and a lot of different cultures, though Graves was really one of the first people in English to kind of put a framework around it in those terms. And then the pagan community and, later the Wiccan community really latched on to this notion of the triple goddess. So it also traces the phases of the moon, going from new to full and then dark again. And some people say that, the crone is related to the dark aspect of the moon. And so it's this idea that women have power at every stage of their life, as does the moon, as does the capital G goddess, if you are one to believe in her or in them. And so it's been wonderful to see the crone be reclaimed in that way, in that witchy, powerful way.